Good afternoon. I'm William Lester, Professor of Chemistry and Chair of the Hitchcock Committee. I'm pleased, along with the Graduate Council, to introduce Dr. Noam Chomsky as part of the Charles M. and Martha Hitchcock Lecture Series. In appreciation for their generous bequest, I'd like to tell you something about how the Hitchcock Lectures came to UC Berkeley. Dr. Charles Hitchcock was a physician for the Army. He moved west during the gold rush and settled in San Francisco, where he opened a private practice that thrived. In 1885, he established a professorship here at Berkeley as an expression of his longtime interest in education. His daughter, Lily Hitchcock Coit, greatly expanded her father's original gift, making it possible for us to present a series of public lectures. The Hitchcock Professorship is one of the most cherished endowments of the University of California, recognizing the highest distinction of scholarly thought and achievement. Thank you, Lily and Charles, and now a few words about our speaker, Noam Chomsky. Dr. Chomsky is no stranger to the Berkeley campus. In fact, he spoke on this very spot to an overflow crowd several years ago, and ever since then, we have wanted him to come back. So we're honored that he has accepted our invitation to be a Hitchcock professor. Noam Chomsky is one of the most influential linguists of our time. He has dominated several fields of linguistics over the past 40 years. He is credited with changing the focus of linguistics from a concern with methods of classification to a search for explanatory principles, and his numerous writings on the subject document this. But Noam Chomsky's influence extends beyond the realm of academia. He is a forceful critic of US foreign policy and a spokesperson against the abuse of power. Noam Chomsky received his PhD in linguistics from the University of Pennsylvania in 1955. He has been a professor at MIT since 1961. He has written numerous books and has received various honorary degrees, awards, and honors. I am very pleased to present Dr. Noam Chomsky.
Thank you. Well, I ended yesterday by describing the so-called principles and parameters approach, which gave the first serious conception, to my knowledge, of how the tension between descriptive and explanatory adequacy might be resolved. In this sense, it's fair, I think, to regard it as the first genuine proposal as to what a theory of language might be. Whether that step turns out to have been right or wrong, it offered a kind of a liberating perspective, which led to an explosion of highly productive inquiry, and it opened new problems to investigation, also revitalized the study of language acquisition along new lines, and other language-related areas of the cognitive sciences. To the extent that outstanding problems can be solved, not a simple matter, but to the extent that that's possible, we will have a conception of the initial conditions that map experience to the state that's attained by the faculty of language, to what I called yesterday the internal language, the I language, that determines the infinite array of sound meaning combinations that the speaker of a language has available for use, the potential expressions of the language. These initial conditions include, but are not exhausted by, the genetically determined initial state of the language organ. In addition, there's the third factor that I mentioned yesterday, general principles that are not coded in the initial state, just as properties of protein folding are not coded in the genome, but are available to be exploited in the growth of the organism. There is, I think, some reason to believe that understanding of language has at last reached a level that makes it feasible to address these questions. That is, to pursue the Galilean intuition that nature is somehow perfect, in this case, asking not only what the properties of language are, but why language has these properties and not others. That inquiry in recent years has been called the Minimalist Program. Notice that that program is theory independent. Whatever you think is the right theory of language, you may or may not decide to pursue these questions. The initial state can, that it can be disaggregated into elements that have a principled explanation and others that remain unexplained at this level of analysis. They have to be attributed, therefore, to something independent, perhaps evolutionary accident or properties of the brain that remain unknown and would have to be investigated along similar lines. The principled elements of the initial state are the conditions that are imposed on the faculty of language by the systems with which it interacts. These are what are called interface conditions. If language is to be usable at all, its design must satisfy these conditions. That is, the information that is in the internal expressions that are generated by the language have to be accessible to other internal systems. That includes language external but person internal systems, including sensory motor systems and conceptual systems that enter into thought and action. So we can therefore restate the deeper problem of determining why language has the peculiar properties that it does, insofar as the properties of an I language can be accounted for in terms of interface conditions and general principles of computational efficiency and the like. They have a principled explanation, and we will have verified the Galilean intuition of perfection of nature in this domain. Well, if one proceeds this far, you face a challenging task. The task is to examine every device, principle, idea, technique that is employed in characterizing languages and try to determine to what extent it can be eliminated in favor of a principled account in terms of general conditions of computational efficiency and the interface conditions that the organ must satisfy to function at all. That's been a focus of a good deal of work in the past few years, and there are by now rather plausible accounts in these terms of some basic processes of the computational system of language. These systems that previously had been stipulated as descriptive technology but can now be reduced to principles of computational efficiency, and also more complex properties of individual languages have, to an interesting extent, been derived from close examination of the way principled mechanisms function under minimization of search and other principles of efficient computation. Furthermore, what appear to be radical differences among languages have, in a number of interesting cases, been reduced to something close to the optimal conclusion. That means that the internal computational processes are identical. The phenomenal differences result not from how the mind computes, but rather how the internal objects that it constructs are related to external events by sensory motor systems. So these the interesting cases involve a category of properties, features with no independent meaning that had not really been noticed before, though they're crucial, it appears, and differences in how the apparent diversity of languages seems to be traceable to a very significant effect to slight differences in the way these uninterpretable features are are externalized, are used by the sensory motor system. It's as if the mind computes in a fixed way, but with varying effects at the mouth and the ear. The general observation, not this far, but the general point was a very natural consequence of the principles and parameters approach. It was recognized from the moment that it came to be formulated with at least some clarity. Actually, I discussed it near here in 1979 at Kant Lectures at Stanford. At that time, I referred to classic work, biological work on regulatory mechanisms by Jacob and Monod, two Nobel laureates, quoting their observations about how slight changes in regulatory mechanisms, utilizing differently the same structural information, might yield enormous phenomenal differences. There are examples, differences between a butterfly and a lion, or a worm and a whale, basically identical organisms, but with minor changes in how regulatory mechanisms function, same mechanisms. Similarly, slight changes in parameters left open in the fixed schematism of language might lead to what appear to be very different systems. Apologies here for quoting myself in 1979. It was actually in the years that followed that such ideas really did begin to bear fruit in the study of language. Similarly, in the biological sciences, there have been quite dramatic progress along similar lines. Such conclusions would have greatly pleased Alan Turing, I think. He's known to philosophers, linguists, logicians, computer scientists, mainly for his work in other areas, but some of his best known work was on morphogenesis and the effects of chemical and physical law on the possible course of evolution. These are matters on which he took a rather strong stand and that have become a central topic in contemporary biology. One fundamental problem that remains is why there is parametric variation at all in the computational system. So why isn't there just one language? There are some possible answers that have been suggested, but the general problem, in my opinion, is still mysterious. It's a problem that eludes our grasp, but you can think of possible answers. One might also hope to approach the question of evolution of language in these terms. It's rather curious to compare the enormous number of pages devoted to the evolution of human language with work on evolution of much simpler systems, say bee communication. A couple of years ago asked a biologist friend to do a database search on that topic, and he could come up with very little. Apparently the subject is considered too difficult to pursue, although bees are just a wonderful subject. They only have 800,000 neurons, a brain the size of a grass seed, many different species that yield rich comparative data, a very brief gestation period, lifespan, no need to obtain consent forms for experiments, and so on, every conceivable advantage. But nevertheless, the problem is considered far too hard to study. The question of how the human language faculty, it might have evolved, is vastly more obscure and hard to study. One can imagine various scenarios. A number have been proposed. Some of them are maybe suggestive. But some leading evolutionary biologists, Richard Lewontin is the most prominent, they have argued strongly that the problem is entirely beyond reach in terms of anything remotely like present understanding. Lewontin at least, extends that to evolution of human mental faculties generally. Well, if we nevertheless want to pose the problem of evolution of language, we have to begin with the recognition shared by everyone that the faculty of language is not a distinct entity. It's not like a box in the human brain with a single location or a single function, whatever that term is supposed to imply. The faculty of language surely recruits processes, capacities, physiological mechanisms that have evolved quite independently. And it could turn out, in principle, that there's nothing in the faculty of language that's specific to language, that the faculty is just a specific form of organization of elements that are recruited to constitute this organ of the body, to borrow Randy Gallistol's term again. If the minimalist approach to language has real prospects of success, and at least my judgment is that it does, we would expect to find that language crucially involves interface conditions and computational processes. Some of these, at least, may have homologous structures in other primates, maybe even beyond. If that's the case, then the study of language will involve in part, the evolution of these elements, the evolution of the way they're organized in the language faculty, and whatever may have evolved independently in the last flick of an eye in evolutionary time in human evolution, and it's extremely short. There is intriguing work, very recent work, on primate perceptual systems that could bear on the topic. For example, a rather surprising discovery that untrained tamarin monkeys distinguish among some language types in ways that are analogous to newborn human infants, in all cases without any experience, though perhaps they use different cues. That's under investigation. Additional work is proceeding along similar lines, also investigating what Harvard primatologist Mark Hauser calls wild minds in natural settings, also experimental work that he and his laboratory are doing on a number of topics, including computational capacities of monkeys on language-like problems. It could turn out that the core computational properties of natural language are found elsewhere in the animal world, perhaps in what perceptual psychologists call the rules of visual intelligence that are used to create what we see, quoting. Conceivably, you might even find them in systems as remote as insect navigation. That possibility and others like them can't be excluded, and they do suggest avenues of research into the evolution of at least some of the factors that enter into human language, avenues that might be promising, in my view at least. If so, that would be the first time that the problem of evolution of language becomes a really serious problem. To proceed further along in any of these areas would require a good deal of background discussion that I can't take time for here. So let me just, and of course this is where the topic gets interesting, but I'll put that aside, and just restate the guiding intuition of the minimalist program, basically Galilean. Insofar as this program succeeds, we will be able to conclude that principles of the kind that one finds, principles that hold for, say, sphere packing in early cell division or formation of polyhedral cells of polyhedral surfaces of viruses, or stability of body forms and symmetries, maybe optimal wiring of neural systems, just general principles of physical and mathematical laws, may also hold for an organ that's a very recent product of evolution and appears to be a crucial component of whatever it is that's specific about human beings, certainly at the core of their existence, their thought, and their interaction, although we have to bear in mind that the classical problems of the theory of mind, the ones that preoccupied Descartes, Newton, and others, they remain as obscure as ever. And the problem of unification, while it takes a wholly different form after the Newtonian revolution, as I mentioned yesterday, that problem remains unsolved. The gaps look as unbridgeable today as they did for chemistry and physics not many years ago, 70 years ago. Well, let me return to the initial question that I began with yesterday. The questions that are sometimes called the problems of intentionality. That is, how does language, this biological entity, how does it relate to the rest of the world? One of these is the unification problem. How do accounts of the brain in terms of computational systems relate to others, say in terms of cells? As long as that question is unanswered, there's a crucial explanatory gap in accounts of behavior, whether it's insect navigation or human language. There's a gap in accounting for how computations eventuate in action. Notice that this is over and above the questions that are not even posed, that is the questions of choice of action. So like, why does a cricket turn left instead of right? What about the second problem of intentionality? That is the use of language to talk about the world, as when I say that I read Darwin's Descent of Man referring to a book. There are parallel problems on the receptive side, but let's focus attention on the questions as they arise for the speaker. These questions have two aspects. One is, how does the sensory motor system use the instructions provided by the internal language to carry out gestures? That would be articulatory gestures in the case of spoken language. And second, how does the system of thought use these instructions to talk about a book or a river or the crisis in Argentina or whatever it may be? It's this second aspect that's held to be particularly vexing. But perhaps one can gain some insight into it by asking about the less contentious interface with sensory motor systems. So we now put aside the explanatory gap that holds for all animal behavior, and we ask how the phonetic information that's generated by the internal language is accessed and used by the sensory motor system for articulation, alternatively perception, but I'm putting that aside. Let's adopt a conventional, but in fact non-trivial assumption, namely that the phonetic information of each expression is encoded in a single internal generated object, what's called its phonetic form or phonetic representation. Here you have to be careful to divorce the notion representation of any connotations drawn from other uses of the term, as in the classical theory of ideas or in discussion of representational art, for example. These problems have been studied intensively with high-tech equipment for half a century and long before that in other ways, but understanding remains quite limited. The problems are not easy. Well, maybe everybody's overlooked an easy solution, which works like this. We all agree that the lexical item, any lexical item, say book, has a sound. And sounds are perfectly robust and familiar notions. So we can tell without difficulty whether some event is the sound of book or the sound of river. Unproblematically, we can speak of the various events that are sounds of book, of the word book, on various occasions of use. So let's just say that the internally generated phonetic representation of the word book just picks out a sound, or many sounds if we like. That relation we can give a name. We can give that relation a name. Let's call it phonetically denote, P denote. Let's say that that relation holds between the internal object and the sound. Its properties will be the properties of the technical notion, denote or refer, that's devised for formal systems, say the relation between the numeral 3 and the Platonic entity 3 in a system of formal arithmetic of the Phrygian variety, for those of you who know some logic or metamathematics. Further inquiries about the sound don't have to bother us. They can be forwarded to the physics department. Perhaps they'll tell us that the sound is some indescribable four-dimensional space-time construct based on motions of molecules. Perhaps inquiries can be forwarded to the sociology department too, if we want to make the task even more hopeless, by introducing some unexplained notion of common language that involves norms and conventions, attitudes, experts, and so on. Well, however we proceed, there aren't any ontological problems, that is, no problems about existence. No one doubts the existence of the particular motion of molecules that I produce when I say book. So there's no problem about the existence of sounds. The notion is perfectly robust, to borrow the standard philosophical term. Problems of communication are very easily solved. You identify what I'm saying because your internal representation P denotes the same sound as mine, or at least a sufficiently similar one. Okay, without proceeding, we've now solved the problems to which acoustic and articulatory phoneticians have devoted so much labor without much success. Well, it's clear enough why this solution has never been proposed. It's a bad joke. The new theoretical notions, sound and P denote, are completely useless. They merely restate the problem in vacuous terminology, leaving the problems, in fact, even in worse shape than before. The proposal has all the virtues of theft over honest toil, to borrow Bertrand Russell's aphorism. The actual course pursued is much harder. We have to discover the elements of the phonetic representation of the word book and others, the properties that constitute it. Those are commonly called its features. And we have to determine how feature complexes are accessed by the sensory motor systems and related to external events, maybe ultimately motions of molecules. There's no determinate mind external object that's picked out by an element of the phonetic representation as its sound. Rather, these internal objects provide information that's accessed by other systems to yield or interpret mind external entities in a variety of ways that depend on circumstances, expectations, and a host of other factors. In fact, the real world problem is so intricate and involves so many variables that no one even contemplates studying it. Actual inquiry keeps to highly idealized experimental situations, as always in the natural sciences. Well, let's now consider an easy answer to the problems that arise on the meaning side, following point by point the preceding ridiculous account of the sound side of language. We all recognize, I made up the other one, but the one I'm going through now is real, unfortunately. We all recognize that the word book has a meaning, just as it has a sound. The entity book, whatever it is, has an internal semantic representation that incorporates all information about its meaning that's determined by the language, just as the internal phonetic representation incorporates all language-determined information about sound. And we know exactly what the word book or its semantic representation picks out in the world, namely books, just as the phonetic representation picks out the sound or the sounds of the word book. So we can therefore set up a relation that's a counterpart of P denote, let's call it S denote, meaning semantically denote. S denote holds that relation, holds between the internal semantic representation of the expression book and books. You understand that I'm talking about books, not tables, because your word book S denotes the same things as mine, and the child acquires the S denotation relation by virtue of causal properties of the world that relate external phenomena to mind internal entities. Let's call them concepts, to use the standard term. Those who are concerned about the status of the external objects that are S denoted don't have to have any qualms. These are some indescribable constructions based on whatever physics tells us about the world. And we can forward further inquiries to the physics department or maybe the sociology department, again, if we want to make it even more hopeless. There aren't any problems about the existence of books. Those are the things that are on bookshelves and tables. It's true that if you and I both took Darwin's Descent of Man out of the library, there is a question about whether one book was taken or two, but we can settle this any way we like. And if someone is concerned that books are simultaneously abstract and concrete and have a host of other extremely odd properties when you look closely, we can answer robustly that that's just what books are. It's a problem of metaphysics, not semantics or cognitive science. Well, it should be clear that something's gone badly wrong. We're back to theft rather than honest toil. For one thing, referring is something that people do, not words. It was stressed 50 years ago by Oxford philosopher Peter Strawson, and known before, of course. And like other human actions, referring is a highly intricate action. It's specific to circumstances, it has normative aspects. The act of referring succeeds or fails in ways that depend on a wide variety of conditions. The act need not even involve terms that have some circumstance-independent relation to the referential intention. So, for example, I can refer to India without using any word or having any thought that has any independent connection to India, whatever India is. If such fundamental properties of referring the act are omitted from consideration, one may be studying something, but it's not the problem of intentionality or aboutness. Well, a fair response that could be given is that exactly in other cases, we have to idealize if we hope to gain some grasp of reality. We have to abstract away from a welter of complexity to focus on the properties of core notions, in this case, S denote or P denote. And that's a reasonable response, but it's a promissory note. As in other cases, it has to be justified by showing how the idealization yields some insight and explanatory power, and doesn't merely reformulate the original dilemmas in misleading ways. That doesn't seem an easy task in the present case, to put it rather mildly. In fact, I think it really is theft rather than honest toil in both cases. The case that's never even discussed, the sensory motor side, and the case that's pretty standard, the analog on the semantic side. Well, how can we approach the problem of what's happening when we think or talk about the world? It's possible, and in my view likely, that the study of sound provides some useful clues to that. In that inquiry, there isn't any reference-like relation between an element of phonetic representation and a mind-external entity. Rather, the speaker-hearer employs the systems of language use to access the phonetic representation, the internal object, so as to produce and interpret organism external events. And perhaps something similar is true on the meaning side. So Smith uses an expression to refer when his attention is focused on some parts of the world, which he views from the complex perspectives that are provided by internalist semantics, very much as in the case of sound. Features of the internal item book in Smith's internal language provide information that's used by other cognitive faculties, constraining the ways that Smith uses it to talk about the world, think about the world differently from other words. Smith succeeds in communicating with Jones to the extent that Jones attends to related parts of the world and has appropriately related perspectives and understanding of circumstances and background. Similarly, Jones's ability to perceive what Smith is uttering depends on his ability to map the noises that he hears to his own internal language. And these are always matters of more or less, not yes or no. Well, that's the point of view that I've personally regarded as reasonable since I began thinking seriously about these topics about 50 years ago, at that time influenced by Oxford Ordinary Language Philosophy and the later Wittgenstein. But as I later learned, the approach has traditional antecedents. There's an important 18th century critique of the theory of ideas based on the observation that the phrase, "he has an idea," should not be understood on the model of "he has a diamond," invoking a reference-like relation between the term idea and some extra mental entity. That's putting aside for the moment whether that's even a proper step in the case of diamond. I think it's not. Rather, the phrase, "he has an idea," 18th century commentators pointed out, the phrase "he has an idea" means something like "he thinks." The phrase is what Gilbert Ryle called a systematically misleading expression in an influential contribution to 20th century ordinary language philosophy, actually resurrecting a traditional critique. And the same conclusion holds for belief, thought, desire, other terms of so-called folk psychology, as expressed in its English language version, which is far from universal and in fact rather idiosyncratic. The basic insights generalized to the whole vocabulary and even more dramatically to more complex expressions constructed from lexical items. If this is anything like correct, most of the work that's going on in philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, and theoretical cognitive science is just off on totally the wrong track. It's my opinion, has been for years. The roots of these insights are far deeper. In fact, they extend well beyond misleading analogic interpretations of surface form, as in the case just mentioned, the 18th century case resurrected by Ryle. Perhaps the first study of these matters was by Aristotle. He asks, for example, what's the nature of a house? And he concludes, quoting Aristotle, we can define a house as stones, bricks, and timbers in terms of its material constitution, or as a receptacle to shelter chattels and living beings in terms of function and design. So I may think that the place that I call home is a house, but I could be wrong. It could really be a library in which some odd people spend much of their time. And in fact, someone entering it for the first time might be pardoned for reaching that conclusion. The answer depends on choice of perspective and on circumstances, which I might not even know. So if that thing was designed to be a library and is characteristically used that way while I'm gone, in fact, much of the time I'm there, then perhaps it really is a library. It's not a house, contrary to what I thought. Or perhaps it's really a garage. Or maybe it's an oddly constructed and misplaced paperweight belonging to a giant, and so on. There simply is no mind-independent truth of the matter, and material constitution, as Aristotle recognized, is only one factor in reaching answers. We can also integrate the factors of material constitution and function design. That's, in Aristotle's terms, combining matter and form. And we can bring in other factors too, some of which he also explored. Well, for Aristotle, these are questions of metaphysics, that is, the way the world is. Notice that he talked about defining house, the thing, not the word house. From the 17th century, there's been a very reasonable tendency to reformulate such analyses in epistemological conceptual terms, that is, as properties of something real, but the construction and interpretation of experience that's provided by our cognitive capacities. That's our cognoscitive powers in 17th century terminology, which include the internal semantics of the language. And in fact, there was quite illuminating discussion of these issues by Hobbes, Cudworth, Locke, many others, sometimes adopting David Hume's principle, that, quoting him, that the identity with which we ascribe to things is only a fictitious one established by the mind, not a peculiar nature belonging to what we are talking about. Well, in all of these matters, textual interpretation is uncertain, but the general idea seems clear enough and very plausible. The house that Smith lives in, or the books that he's reading, surely do not have their strange and quite intricate properties by virtue of some mind-independent constitution. And the properties really are strange and intricate as soon as you look at the meanings of the words carefully. Dictionaries have nothing to say about this, they just presuppose it. Rather, they have these properties by virtue of the way Smith and others think in particular circumstances and the internal meanings of the terms in which these thoughts are internally or sometimes externally expressed. These devices, in turn, are a property of fixed and shared internal human nature, as are other aspects of their lives and being. The semantic properties of expressions are used to think and talk about the world in terms of perspectives that are made available by the resources of the mind, rather in the way that the sounds of language seem to function, in the latter case, as everyone assumes. I've tried to show elsewhere, and won't review, that these conclusions are supported by descriptive observations that are in a tradition, 17th, 18th century tradition, that's been much too long forgotten and greatly reinforced when we look more closely into the meanings of even the simplest words, including those investigated in 17th, 18th century philosophy, British empiricism, and others, words like tree or river or person, or names of substances like water, or the most elementary devices of reference and anaphora, probably every aspect of language. All are far more intricate than has commonly been supposed, so much so that they must come to us from the original hand of nature, in David Hume's phrase, and hence must be fundamentally the same for all languages. These topics have been addressed in illuminating work by Julius Moravcik over at Stanford on what he calls the ideational theory of meaning, bringing classical sources to bear on contemporary issues of language and thought. Others have pursued them too, and the approach seems to me to have a lot to recommend it. Well, what about Fregean systems, the ones that are usually adopted? That is, systems based on the relation of denote or refer, holding between linguistic objects and extra-linguistic entities. It seems to me that these are reasonable enough for Frege's specific purposes, most important for what really interested him, namely formal studies of mathematical objects, at least understood Platonistically in his terms. The ideas also seem appropriate as a kind of a normative ideal for the specific human enterprise of science. That is, one hopes that such notions as a black hole or oxygen or electromagnetic field will pick out something in the world, in the mind-independent world. And we hope that the same will be true of the internal entities and computational principles that are postulated in the study of insect navigation or visual perception or human language. There's also some evidence that animal communication, outside of humans, is based on a notion of representation that's similar to the invented technical concept of reference that's familiar in the study of formal systems. Here the concept representation is understood as isomorphism, that is a one-to-one relation between mind-brain processes and an aspect of the environment to which these processes adapt the animal's behavior, as for example when an ant picks out the corpse of a conspecific by its odor. Actually, I'm quoting here again Randy Gallistel in the comprehensive introduction to a series of essays on animal representation. Well, if the picture that I've just briefly reviewed is anywhere near accurate, it could turn out that the use of language, human language, to refer or in other ways is totally different from animal communication systems in this as in numerous other respects. Human language might not have any denotational semantics, just an intricate form of pragmatics along with very rich internal syntax that includes what's usually called semantics but ought to be called syntax. It's the study of internal representations. Of this amalgam, The parts that we can currently hope to understand in most depth are the internal syntax, what's called semantics. A theory of human action that would bear in some revealing way on the act of referring is far more remote than comparable theories for much simpler organisms and actions, domains in which the problem is scarcely even entertained because it's understood to be far too complicated. Well, so far I've kept to language, but in principle, everything I've said should carry over to the study of other mental qualities. In practice, however, the difficulties mount very quickly. Language appears to be relatively isolated from other cognitive capacities. Here I'm referring to its structure, not its use or particular components which are integrated into the structure, which could be individually shared with other cognitive faculties or even other species, as I mentioned before. One of the reasons why language is a good topic for study, for inquiry into the mind, is its essential role in human affairs, but another is that it is indeed, or appears to be, relatively isolated. When we turn to other aspects of mind, for example, our moral nature, it's much harder to isolate components for separate study. That means to abstract them from reflective thought and a variety of other factors. Nonetheless, those topics, study of our moral nature, have been subjected to investigation in various ways. That includes interesting thought experiments, actual experiments with children in the last couple of years, and comparative studies. Not uncommonly, the real world offers illustrations of how these faculties function, sometimes with very painful choices. Issues like that test our moral faculties and may help us to discover something about their nature. Sometimes this perspective is counterposed to what's called a relativistic one, which holds in an extreme form that apart from their basic physical structure, humans have no nature. They have only history, or that their thought and behavior can be modified without limit. Nothing like this can be even close to true if taken literally, though it seems to be what is sometimes said. In a version due to Richard Rorty, history and anthropology, I'm quoting him, show that humans have extraordinary malleability. We're coming to think of ourselves as the flexible, protean, self-shaping animal rather than as having specific instincts. There can be no moral progress in human affairs, just different ways of looking at things. We should put aside the vain effort of exploration of our moral nature or reasoned argument about it. We should keep to what he calls manipulating sentiments if we happen to be for or against torture or massacre, for example. I suspect I'm misinterpreting because it's hard to believe that the words are intended to mean what they seem to say. Well, such proposals have evoked a good deal of criticism. The Oxford philosopher Galen Strawson, quoting related statements of Rorty's on the irrelevance of the extra-linguistic world to truth, he asks whether the nonsense might be less bad if it didn't build in such an astonishing contempt for the reality of human suffering. His conclusion is it's just as bad. A recent paper on the philosophical foundations of human rights by Matthias Malmann, discussing Rorty and others, points out that, quoting him, nobody would have taken a Nazi seriously who had claimed in 1945 that the sole basis for the moral condemnation of the Holocaust by the rest of the world is just due to some kind of culturally relative emotional manipulation based on shrewdly devised sentimental stories. If that's so, and I assume it is, we want to understand why, and if nobody really means no normal human being, that leads us back to the hard questions of intrinsic human nature. This notion of unique human malleability is not at all novel. It's been a fairly conventional view, at least back to the beast-machine controversies that were inspired by Descartes. For example, the argument of James Harris, British philosopher, in 1740, that unlike animals and machines, the leading principle of man is multiform, originally uninstructed, pliant, and docile. The idea that human alleged weakness of instinct leads to vast variety and extreme malleability has had a long and, in fact, inglorious history ever since. Well, with no metric and little understanding, it's hard to know what to make of those judgments. But whatever merit they have, they cannot offer an alternative to the conception that I just outlined. No one doubts that a person's understanding and judgment and values and goals reflect acquired cultures, norms, conventions, and so on. But these aren't mind external entities. They're not acquired by taking a pill. They're constructed by the mind on the basis of scattered and constructed experience, and they're constantly applied in circumstances that are novel and complex. Actually, these facts and their significance were discussed 250 years ago by David Hume, who observed, I'm quoting him, that the number of our duties is in a manner infinite. Therefore, just as in other parts of the study of nature, we must seek a few general principles upon which all our notions of morals are founded, principles of human nature that are original instincts of the human mind. They're perhaps enhanced by reflection, but steadfast and immutable as components of fixed human nature. Hume, notice, is articulating the basic idea behind generative grammar in a different cognitive domain and centuries earlier. Like Adam Smith, Hume took sympathy to be what he called a very powerful principle in human nature, one of our original instincts, and the grounding of much else. That idea was reconstructed in a Darwinian framework about 100 years ago by the anarchist natural historian Peter Kropotkin in what I think should be taken as the founding work in what's nowadays called evolutionary psychology. And there's recent work that suggests some possible evolutionary scenarios. Well, there's little reason to suppose that the variety of cultural outcomes reflects significant variety of genetic endowment, so we're back to the situation we face in the study of language or the visual system or any other basic property of organisms. It's necessary to account for the richness and specificity of outcome on the basis of shared intrinsic nature, tolerating variation, but within a highly structured range as throughout the biological world. Well, to this picture, we should add other conceptions that have been studied in recent years and also resurrecting the 17th century origins of modern science. One strand is the recognition that our innate capacities are only latent. That is, they have to be triggered by experience to be manifested. Then they're manifested in ways determined by our intrinsic nature, much as susceptibility to a disease is innate, though the disease requires an external trigger. That's actually the analogy that Descartes suggested in discussing innate ideas. One of the reasons why Locke's famous critique is beside the point, as long recognized. Another idea that was fruitfully examined in the 17th century is that the phenomena of the world around us do not in themselves constitute experience. They become experience for us as they are constructed by our modes of cognition. I'm quoting 17th century work. They must therefore conform to these modes of cognition. This is 17th century picture, came into modern thought through Kant's version of it. These modes of cognition are a distinctive property of our nature. They differ for different organisms. They're what the evolutionary biologist Konrad Lorenz called a biological a priori in work that I, in fact, discussed here 35 years ago. That's also true of the rich mental constructions that we call cultures, norms, and conventions, insofar as they're shared by groups that interact in complex ways. Well, still assuming that each child is intrinsically capable of acquiring any culture over a very broad range, the process of mental construction of experience and interpretation of it is based on the common genetic constitution, which must be rich to the extent that the outcomes are highly structured and constrained in ways that do not simply reflect features of the environment, basically Hume's observation. It seems unavoidable that the so-called relativistic approaches must be profoundly innatist, at least if they're willing to address the issues of nature, acquisition, and use of attained systems, Hume's questions. If so, then they fall together with the study of visual or linguistic systems or other properties of organisms. Hard to see any serious distinctions here, or any interpretation under which relativistic approaches differ from the most highly innatist approaches. Well, one last word on the import of any conclusion, and it has to be a very tentative conclusion about human nature. One way to assess the importance of such conclusions is to observe how deeply they enter into conceptions of right and justice and the struggles that they engender. It's very easy to illustrate from personal relations to international affairs. More generally, every approach to how human relations should be arranged, whether it's revolutionary or reformist or committed to stability, every such approach is based on some conception of human nature, at least implicitly. If it has any claim to moral standing, it's advanced with the claim that it's beneficial to humans, meaning because of their intrinsic nature, at least as one of its crucial qualities. We should face honestly the fact of our ignorance, which is profound, but yet recognize that we have no choice but to proceed on the best tentative assumptions we can reach. For many of the classical mysteries, quite extraordinary bodies of doctrine have been developed in the past several hundred years. They're some of the greatest achievements of the human intellect. They also have far-reaching implications for human life. And there have been some remarkable feats of unification as well, sometimes very surprising in how they turned out, as in the cases I discussed yesterday. How remote the remaining mountain peaks are, even where they are, one can scarcely guess. Within the range of feasible inquiry, there's plenty of work to be done in understanding mental aspects of the world, including human language. We would do well, however, in my opinion, to keep in some corner of our minds Hume's conclusion about nature's ultimate secrets and the obscurity in which they ever did and ever will remain, and particularly the reasoning that led him to that judgment and the confirmation of that reasoning in the subsequent history of the hard sciences. These are matters that are too easily forgotten, I suspect, and that merit serious reflection, perhaps someday even constructive scientific inquiry. Thank you.
We have a number of questions that we'd like to put to you.
Okay.
First of these is, when you say that language is a matter of computation, do you mean in the observer-relative or the observer-independent sense? And do humans really start off in the world with the requisite concepts to express things like carburetor and bureaucrat?
Well, as far as the first part is concerned, we could ask the same question about insect navigation. So take the very complex, you take a look at, say, the study of insects by scientists. You find that they attribute to the insect highly intricate computational systems which enable, say, bees or ants to do things that are far out of our range. I mean, we can't determine the azimuth of the sun as a function of the time of year and day, or do dead reckoning the way an ant can, and so on and so forth. The explanations of these that are offered in the literature are computational systems. Are they independent of the observer? Well, in the sense that any science is independent of the observer. So when you have a model of the, say, planetary system, in a sense, it's relative to the observer. That is, we can't get out of our skins. That's hopeless. But the enterprise of science is an effort to get out of our skins as much as we can. You try to construct an account of the world that is as observer independent as we can manage. There are limits to this, for example, studied in quantum physics, but we can put that aside. So yes, it's observer independent in the sense in which any scientific construct is observer independent, no different. It's true whether it's computational systems of insects, whether it's computational systems of humans, whether it's the planetary system, or anything else that science tries to understand. As for carburetor and bureaucrat, I have to say that my friend Jerry Fodor was a little offended by the fact that the statement you quoted was attributed to me in a recent article. Actually, it's his proposal, and he wrote to me that he's sorry that it came up because he can prove that the notion carburetor isn't innate, since he doesn't even know how to spell it, you know. But the fact is that he was making a very serious point. His point was that we have to somehow account for the fact that terms like carburetor and what was the other, bureaucrat, we do understand. Just as we understand river and tree and person and very simple words, and we understand them on the basis of extremely limited evidence, and we have a rich and complex understanding of them. So we're back to the problem of why we grow arms rather than wings. You can't just wave your hand about it and say, well, it's the culture, because then we have to ask, how did we acquire the culture? And as I said, it's not by taking a pill. The culture is a construction of the mind on the basis of scattered experience. So the answer that Fodor takes a stronger position than I do. I don't want to defend his position, but in general, this is the problem. What is it about the nature of our minds, the intrinsic nature of our minds, that allows us to acquire concepts like river, person, tree, water, book, carburetor, bureaucrat, even though we have very scattered experience? And that's the general problem of developmental biology. And the only answer that anyone knows is the one I just quoted from Hume, talking about our moral nature 250 years ago, and the one that's assumed by every biologist for everything except human mental qualities. It's got to come somehow from the intrinsic nature of our minds. And in that respect, it's innate. The fact that it's difficult to accept is a sign of our irrationality, because it's got to be that way, unless it's a miracle. You know, it's either a miracle or it's pretty much along the lines that Fodor suggested, maybe not as extreme as his position.
Thank you. Somewhat related, the second question is it a good idea or not to search for evolutionary precursors to language, whether in cognitive, sensory, or motoric systems?
Yeah, it's a good idea. In fact, if you can find any, fine. In fact, I suppose the question was written before the comments I made. Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it's a fine idea. In fact, I think we're just getting to the point where it may be possible to do it. I mean, if in fact something like the program that I very sketchily outlined, if something like it turns out to be correct, that is, if we can give a principled explanation for significant aspects of language in terms of interface conditions, you know, and computational principles, then it makes perfect sense to search not only for, I wouldn't call them precursors, for homologs, you know, homologous structures in other organisms that happen to be like this. And as I say, we might find very remote ones. We might, I don't think anyone expects it, but you can't exclude the possibility that we might discover that the basic computational principles of language show up in insect navigation. It's not impossible. In fact, it's not even crazy. It wouldn't be a precursor to language, like bees aren't a precursor to humans. Remember, species are not precursors of one another. Like bees are no more precursors of us than we are of bees. It's just different evolutionary lines. If you can find sensory or perceptual or other computational components in the nature of other organisms that have some potentially homologous relationship to human language, yeah, that would be interesting, of course. That's what evolutionary studies are about.
Well, further proof that these were written before you spoke is given by the next question. Why are children geniuses of language between ages 1.5 and 4, yet other cognitive abilities are still developing at a much more concrete, much less abstract level?
It's kind of like asking why children undergo puberty around age 12 instead of age 35. That's the way that's the way we're designed. We're designed so that certain things happen at particular times. In that respect, we're like every other organism in the world. I mean, binocular vision, being able to focus your eyes and use that for depth perception and so on, that comes along at around 4 months. So we might ask, well, why does it come along at 4 months and not at 1 month or 6 years? Well, the answer to that would have to be something about the way we're genetically programmed. All of these questions are much too hard to answer. Nobody knows answers to any questions like that, even for primitive organisms, what we call primitive, like insects, which are by no means primitive. But to try to answer the question for language is far beyond reach. Nobody knows how genetic instructions create an organism. That's one of the reasons why the Human Genome Project is looked at with some skepticism by many biologists. You could know the entire human genome, and that would tell you very little about humans, because you don't know how you go from genetic instructions to an organism. That's an incredibly complex process, only tiny bits of which are understood. And this is just one of those many questions, all of them very poorly understood.
Somewhat different direction is indicated by the next question. If the study of language is a branch of natural science and language consists of a lexicon plus computations, how would you respond to Searle's critique that computation is not a notion of natural sciences like mass or photosynthesis, but an abstract mathematical notion which is entirely relative to the observer?
Yeah, same. Well, first of all, it's not relevant. It's relative to the observer in the same way that any scientific construct is. Yes, in that sense, of course it is. Is it an abstract mathematical concept? Sure it is, just like Fourier analysis, calculus. Anything that's used in the sciences is an abstract, in the advanced sciences, is an abstract mathematical concept that is applied to particular situations. That's why Newton and Leibniz had to invent calculus in order to study the effects of motion. And the same is true here. Computational systems are particular kinds of mathematical notions that appear to be very well adapted to problems like, say, insect navigation, bee communication, human language, and some other things. So the point is correct. Yeah, it is an abstract mathematical concept used in these areas to give us the best theories that we can find. If somebody can find a better theory that doesn't involve computation, great. Let's have a look at that for insects or humans or anything else. But until then, we just work with the best theories we can find. Notice that this is very similar to what I talked about yesterday concerning chemistry. Up until very recently, in fact, less than a century ago, 1920s, leading scientists described chemistry in exactly the same way. They said it's just a computational system, it's just an invented computational system, it's a calculating device, it yields the phenomenal effects that you see in experiments, but it's not real. It can't be real. It's just something that people invented in order to have some way of organizing the phenomena that they discover in experiments. Why can't it be real? Well, because it couldn't be reduced to physics, which was true. Couldn't be reduced to physics. Reason, physics was wrong. So it couldn't be reduced to physics. After physics was radically revised by the development of quantum physics, Linus Pauling succeeded in giving a quantum theoretic account of the chemical bond. He won the Nobel Prize for it. It's 1935, it's not that long ago. And then chemistry and physics were unified, and everyone recognized that all of this talk about calculating devices was complete nonsense. Chemistry was the best theory you could devise for dealing with these problems. And that's the only notion of reality that we have. We don't have any other notion. The only notion of reality we have is whatever our best theories provide. There's nothing else. So chemistry was as real as you like, happened to be more real than physics, which was on a wrong track. When physics changed, they became unified. You get contemporary science. In this case, the best theories we have, as far as anyone knows, are computational theories. So that's reality. If neurophysiology doesn't integrate with them, we don't know where the problem is. Maybe in the brain sciences, maybe in the computational theories, maybe everything's on the wrong track. That's often happened in the history of science too. You know, you don't know the answers until you find the answers. But there are no questions about reality and calculating devices and observer relativity and so on. They simply do not arise for reasons which are well understood. We have a couple of centuries of history of the hard sciences from which we ought to be able to learn some lessons, including these. And they apply in this case as in earlier cases.
As a theoretical chemist, thank you for transcending some boundaries. Moving along, you mentioned yesterday that a number of theories of biolinguistics are, quote, pointless or obviously misguided. Why then do other scholars continue to pursue them?
Got to ask the other scholars. I can't. It depends. I mean, I mentioned a few and gave some reasons why I think they're misguided. Incidentally, those were not theories of biolinguistics. Those were theories of language which deny that language is a part of the world.
I see.
I think that's seriously misguided.
You have disqualified Quine's radical translation paradigm, calling it a new, quote, methodological, epistemological dualism, close quote. Could you explain this more?
Well, the radical translation, there's a little misunderstanding of this. The radical translation paradigm, the fact that this will only be intelligible to those of you who know this stuff, but Quine's conclusion about what he calls indeterminacy of translation that comes from this paradigm, I don't disagree with that conclusion. I think the conclusion is correct. It just seems to me a truism. That's what I thought when I was a student of Quine's in graduate school 50 years ago, and we argued about it then, and I still think so. It's true, but it's a truism. In fact, it's just one example of underdetermination of theories by evidence, known to be a truism, at least since Hume. Quine's argued that there's something more involved, but I don't think he's demonstrated it. You can look at the literature and see. As for the radical translation paradigm, that's an approach to the study of language that we would never adopt in the study of anything else, say insect navigation or any topic. You would never adopt that paradigm. In that case, you have to ask, why do you adopt it for why do you propose it for human language? Well, as far as I can see, that's a kind of methodological dualism. It's saying we somehow have to approach higher human mental faculties by methods that we would never use anywhere else in studying the physical world. Now, that's not old-fashioned metaphysical dualism. It's something much worse, methodological dualism. Metaphysical dualism, mind-body dualism, that was a scientific theory. It was a substantial scientific theory. It was the early scientific revolution, Galileo through Newton. It was a serious scientific theory. There was a conception of matter in terms of a mechanistic picture of the world, what's called contact mechanics, common sense mechanics. Things interact if they're in contact, what we all intuitively believe, even if we've taken a physics course and know that it's false. We still believe it because we can't help it. It's our nature. So contact mechanics was developed, gave a picture of matter. There were clearly some things it couldn't accommodate. It's Descartes' point, and he was correct. He therefore postulated a different principle to account for them. That's science. It's the right way to do science. He was shown to be wrong in a surprising way. namely matter doesn't exist. Okay, therefore you can't, doesn't matter, it's of no interest that other phenomena don't fall within the concept of matter because nothing does. Okay, so that ends metaphysical dualism. There's no more mind-body problem. Methodological dualism is just pernicious. There's no reason why we should study human higher mental faculties in suicidal ways, which we would never use in studying other topics. Why should we do that? That's a kind of a methodological dualism which has no saving graces as far as I can see.
Thank you so much, and thank you for a couple of wonderful presentations. Please join me in thanking Dr. Chomsky.